Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Well, Richard, we've wrapped up the Experiencing God mini-series.
We have. People thought we never would. I'm sure we'll return to it.
Yeah. I'm sure there'll be some follow-up here and there, but that's behind us, and it turned out to not be too mini of a series, a bit of an epic mini-series, and but it was fun to do. We got a lot of great feedback from that, and so today we're back on to the leadership book review. And tell us this book that we have. We try to announce these in advance, and as if you guys have been listening, you know we're reading The Character of Leadership.
Yep. And
they take a look at the principles of Machiavelli, which on the face of it, this seems a bit dangerous and kind of out of character, perhaps, for a Blackaby leadership podcast. So why don't you explain some of this for us?
It doesn't sound. It's not. This is not coming from the Sermon on the Mount today. But I've taught a number of PhD and doctorate ministry seminars over the years, and a lot of times I'll have this as one of the books to be read, and so I'll have some very spiritual, godly books in there, but then I'll put this one in, and it's actually written by two Christians for primarily nonprofits, but this would also certainly apply to business as well. And it's called The Character of Leadership, and the subtitle, Political Realism and Public Virtue in Nonprofit Organizations. And a little kind of promo at the top says, Rethinking Good Leadership in Light of a Fresh Encounter with Machiavelli. Wow. It's written by Michael Jinkins and Deborah Bradshaw Jinkins. One of the things that I like about this book, I think it's a good corrective. I think you have to read this book carefully. I've had actually some people in seminars where I required this book that they told me later, they said it actually made them angry, the first chapter or so, why they should even read this, and it went so contrary to what they believed in terms of Christian leadership and so on. But the more they read into it, the more they began to realize, boy, this is a very practical book because it deals with real-life stuff that you face in leadership. And so...
I think people's gut reaction to anything about Machiavelli is typically, like that's not good, stay away.
And of course, if you read Machiavelli, it's considered a classic in literature and political leadership thought. But basically, he's talking about the pragmatic approach to leadership. How do you make leadership work? And especially when organizations are complicated. It'd be great if everybody did the right thing and they were all good people. When people don't do the right thing, when evil is pervasive and people are deceptive and there's power plays and people trying to undermine your leadership, well, then sometimes you need more of a Machiavellian type of approach to leadership.
Yeah.
And so, it's interesting because I just had a guy contact me this week, and he said, I've heard this story, Sam, so many times that it just it angers me, real honestly. But over and over again. In fact, I think our next little mini series may be on this. But this is what will happen. A church is struggling, it's declining, it's aging, it's getting to the point where it's emptying out, it can't pay its bills. So they call a pastor who's willing to come to this very messed up congregation. And this pastor loves Jesus, loves people, loves the gospel, and he just starts to love on people and reach out, and they start growing again. And this particular guy, he's ending up baptizing a bunch of new converts. People are coming to church. In this case, they actually built a new building, a brand new part of their facility. Everything's going great. And you talk to this pastor, and he thinks, God is good. Boy, God's at work. The gospel is being shared. People are finding Christ. And then one day he gets bushwhacked by two deacons, and these two older men just vent on him and actually use profanity with him. They get so angry, telling him that he's ruined the church and he's changed all the music to stuff they can't stand, and he's making decisions without running it past people like them, and they've lost control, and it's just best that he leave. And so, of course, this pastor completely caught off guard, totally by surprise. I mean, as far as he was concerned, this was just glorious and things were wonderful. He didn't see this coming at all. And so he's completely shocked. He's thrown completely off balance. And so, as often happens, he feels like, wow, I must have completely misread this. Maybe I'm not the leader I thought I was. Maybe things aren't as good as I thought they were. And so he resigns and he leaves. And now these carnal, profane, ungodly men have the church back under their control again. And very quickly, the church declines in attendance again. A lot of the new people leave, and it's back to the struggling church that these men can control. That story happens over and over and over and over again. And every time I talk to these pastors, they'll say, I just didn't see it. I'm completely flabbergasted. I thought everything was great. I thought everybody loved me, that they all loved God. They loved the direction. I just assumed that a church that was dying would be thrilled that it was growing again and reaching new people. And this is what Machiavelli and what the Jinkins would call a lack of realism. He says leaders must deal in reality. And he says too often leaders are naive. They see the organization that they want to have, what they would like it to be, but they don't see the organization as it really is. The real politic would be the sort of technical word to say, what is the condition here? I know these people have called me to be their leader, their pastor, their CEO, but underlying that, I sense hostility, ambition, resistance, naysayers. And so how do you lead where you're very much aware of the landmines that are out there before you? You're not so naive to think that just because no one complains or speaks out against you in a public meeting that they're all for you. Just because no one is criticizing you to your face doesn't mean that there's not all kinds of gossiping going on behind closed doors. And so it's a darker, seamier side of leadership, but anyone who's led for very long knows that even in the church, even in places where you assume you're dealing with good people, Christian people, there's evil. And there are people that don't tell you the truth, and they don't, what they say to your face is not what they say behind your back. And people who claim to be your friends will stab you in the back the first chance they have. Sadly, that's also part of leadership. And so that's why I usually want people to at least be exposed to a book like this, because you just need to have that in your tool belt. Hopefully you don't have to deal with that often, but I tell leaders, there's you can't be 100% certain of this, but if you get bushwhacked, if you get completely caught by surprise, if key leaders in your organization, maybe direct reports or VPs or deacons or elders, if one day you think they're your friends and the next day they're trying to fire you, if you're that out of touch with where they're at, then it may well be that you've not been leading as well as you should have, that you've been naive about some things. You've been looking at things as the way you want them to be, not the way they actually are. And so I think it's good to at least be aware of these issues. It will mean that it's less likely you're going to be caught by surprise at some point in your leadership career.
Yeah, so it's the book has got some practical advice in it for dealing with that. So what are some of the takeaways that you saw that you think are worth sharing?
Well, there's some great quotes in here. One of them I like is, however inspiring martyrs may be, they do a poor job of leading organizations over the long haul.
Yeah, I like that one.
And I tell you, especially in the church, these pastors, so often they appear to be martyrs. They, 2 or 3 people run them out of a church where there's a couple of hundred who like them, who love them. And it's like, how could you let 2, 3 people run you out of a church where there's at least 100 who love you and are
want you to stay
brokenhearted that you leave? But they typically they'll say, well, I didn't want that kind of conflict. I knew it was going to get ugly. there was going to be a lot of mudslinging, or I didn't want my wife to go through that, or my husband to hear that, or my kids to hear that. So they'll just say, I just thought it was better to leave. And so they leave, and you sort of feel sorry, because these are very godly, nice people that didn't deserve to be treated that way, and we all kind of feel sorry for them. And essentially, they're martyrs. Nice people that got sacrificed to the interests of evil people. But what this book is saying is, you can maybe think highly of a martyr, but you don't want a martyr leading you. I don't want a martyr leading me into a charge against the enemy. I want someone that looks the enemy over and says, this is how we will overcome the enemy. And so if you're a leader, don't lead like a martyr. You think highly of martyrs. You think, wow, I was a really nice person, but they just didn't lead us well. And so that's a great quote. And the politically, one of the examples they use is that of Neville Chamberlain, of course, the Prime Minister of England, who took on Adolf Hitler,
right?
And he came back and he got Adolf Hitler to sign a document promising to be good, And Chamberlain comes back and famously waves this piece of paper that Adolf Hitler signed and says, "We have peace for our time, peace with honor." And of course, he doesn't have that. He's been lied to. He's basically naively assumed that as a British gentleman, he can just sit down man to man with Hitler and work out a deal. And he completely misreads the whole situation, misreads the person he's dealing with, and plunges the country into certain war. And so this book says you've got to be realistic, and don't be a martyr where you set yourself up to be damaged and betrayed. And so that's a great one. He says a couple other things I think that are great. Another one he says is that it's easier to back down from a yes or from a no than it is from a yes. And I think that's an interesting phrase.
Yeah, so
there.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah,
what does it mean to back down from easier to back down from a no than it is to back down from a yes?
Well, he would say that, for instance, if you come into a new management position and maybe you're promoted you're going to be manager of these people, and you want your direct reports to like you. So you can count on it when you have a new leadership role. People are going to come and say, "Hey, do you think it'd be okay if we do this? Would it be okay if I sometimes came in late and maybe adjusted my schedule, or could I leave early, or could I do this? Could I do that?" And of course, you want people to like you, so your first instinct is to say, "Well, I guess that'd be okay," or
Seems okay, yeah.
we can see how that would work, or and so you basically say yes, but then there's always some people that will abuse freedom.
Yeah.
Some people that will always want to push farther than what they were granted. And so at some point you realize, okay, this isn't working out. They're taking advantage of this freedom they have. They're not being responsible. They're not internally motivated to work hard when they're not being supervised. I'm going to have to tighten things up. I'm going to have to say, okay, I know I said yes, but now I need to say no. I need to qualify it. And so, but once you've given freedom to somebody, what they're saying is it's really hard to take that freedom away. Well, you said that we could. You promised when we started this. You told us it was okay. Like, well, now you're changing your mind. And you can't take this away from us. We have a right because you said that one time earlier. But what the Jinkins would say, and what Machiavelli would say, is when in doubt, say no. If you've got some red flags, if you have some concerns, if you're not sure how that would work out, you're being pressured. Well, can we or can't we? We need to know. Would you let us do this? If you feel any kind of pressure and you've got some red flags saying, I'm not so sure this is going to work. I don't know these people well enough. I don't know if I could trust them with this freedom. Then he says, better to say no. You know what? If you just need an answer right now, it's no. I'm going to think some more, but for now, no. Well, then, if you watch these folks and you realize they're very internally motivated, very responsible, very reliable, very loyal, well, then you can come back later and say, you know what? The standard rule is no, but in this case, I think I'm going to let you have this extra freedom. So the operating principle is no. Normally you can't do this, but I'm going to make an exception for you here and say yes. In this case, you can. For this particular situation, I'm going to let you have some more freedom. Well, he says, then of course people appreciate you because you said no, but now you're showing trust. They've earned some respect from you, and so you're gonna lighten up a little bit, at least in this case. He says always better to do it that way, which is just very practical advice.
Yeah.
One other thing he says is that better to be respected as a leader than loved. And again, you have to kind of think that through a little bit, but of course, you really want both. You want people to respect you and like you. Most leaders like that. They want that.
Most people in general want to be liked.
But he says, if you ever get to a place where you have to decide one or the other, what happens a lot of times is, and I mean, you even see this when you try to lead at home. If you're a parent and you want your kids just to love you, so you don't discipline them. You don't ever set any limit. You never hold them accountable because you just want them to love you. Well, when they lose their respect for you, oftentimes they'll also lose their love for you. And so he would say, be careful, because it's fine to do nice things for your employees and those you lead, but be careful, because if they ever lose their respect for you, if you become seen as a doormat that they just can take advantage of, and you always say yes, you always back down, you never hold them accountable, then at a certain point they just have a field day, and not only will they not respect you, but they won't like you either.
Yeah, and growing up, I knew some folks who had no respect for their parents, and that's hard to watch, and you just see the zero control that the parent has.
And it's just such a bad deal, because you don't get anything ultimately. You don't get their love or their respect.
Well, let's take a quick break here, and I imagine there's some ways that which you could take some of these principles too far. So maybe we'll look at some of the darker side of this when we come back.
Twice a year, Blackaby Ministries hosts a spiritual leadership coaching workshop in the Atlanta area. The focus of this workshop is learning how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. The next workshop is November 4th through 6th, and registration is open now. The early bird rate is available until October 1st, and space is limited. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org. Links will be in the show notes.
Well, Richard, this is definitely some very interesting stuff here from this book and from Machiavelli. I think you had one more quote you wanted to share with us, and then we'll look at the dark side.
Yeah, the dark side of Machiavelli. There's lots of good statements in here, I think, that are great. He talks quite a bit about understanding culture of an organization.
Yeah.
If you're, which is another way of just saying, get the lay of the land, know what you're working with,
know what's happening.
But he also says something. They say something I think that's great. They say, we do not learn from experience. We learn from disciplined reflection on experience. You can have the same experience 6 times. You could 6 different times get fired from a job because you didn't lead well. You may not be any wiser for it. When you keep repeating the same experience, you're not learning anything.
Yeah. You
would have changed what you're doing. They talk about disciplined reflection, where you actually take time to look back and say, how did I mishandle that? Maybe I tried to qualify a yes. Maybe I was too easygoing up front, and when I had to start tightening things up, then everything exploded in my face. Okay, well, next time I'm going to try to qualify a no instead. That's easier. Or maybe I was just too trusting. I just took everything at face value.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean I'm rude to people, but it just means I don't quite show my hand too early.
And he mentions sort of having this focused skepticism as well. Not taking everything at face value, but not being a total paranoid person, but just knowing that there are maybe other things in play than what's being said to you, when it's being said to you. Those sort of things.
Right. And so that's why he just says, watch for your idealism. I mean, it's great to have an ideal, but leadership deals with reality. And so it's fine to have a vision of where your organization may be at some point, but you have to deal with where your organization is right now.
Yeah. The idealism, I think, is fun and exciting.
Yeah.
Right. Like you like to look out and say, oh, this is what it could be. And wouldn't that be great? And
it's a vision. It's where you may want to get your organization to, where you do have really supportive, good people that you can trust. But that's not necessarily what you've got to work with now. So it says you always kind of have this certain skepticism where it doesn't mean you're necessarily a negative person, but you just don't take things at face value. You dig a little deeper before you commit yourself and before you show your hand or make some long-term commitments. Now he says they say a couple of things I think that you just have to be real careful with. One of those is he says this duplicity sometimes is a tool that leaders have to use. And of course Machiavelli is known for that kind of statement. That's what he's notorious for. But he says that what they say is that, for instance, deception is seen as a vice in peacetime if you deceive people, but in times of war, it's actually considered a virtue.
Right.
Winston Churchill had said, the truth is so precious in wartime that you have to surround it with bodyguards of lies. And so that's one that I think people really struggle with. And so, for instance, an example of that might be maybe this person that came to the church and wanted to change it. It's dying. It's filled with aging people and no youth anymore. And so maybe they interview him as a pastor, and one of the questions is, well, are you just going to change all of our music? Are you going to make us stop singing hymns and make us sing just modern choruses? Well, I think these people might say, you might not just flat out lie, but you might not tell them their worst case scenario, their worst fears, and say, yeah, first thing when I get there, we're going to have to just change all the music that you like,
Yeah.
You realize they're probably not going to call you then as pastor, and they're probably going to die as a church. So Machiavelli would say, in a sense, this is a wartime situation where this church basically is going to die and shut down unless it gets a major leadership intervention. So he would basically say, so you just don't show all your cards in your hand, and you might be a little bit more nebulous and say, well, we'll certainly try not to change anything we don't have to. We'll certainly try to hold on to all the things that are important to you as a church. But you know full well that in the long run, if you're going to start attracting younger families and teenagers, that you are going to have to certainly insert more modern music. And so you know that, but you don't necessarily say it up front. Now, those listeners you have to decide if that's really what a godly person needs to do. I would tend to think, and we've talked a bit about this before, about leading change, that there's other ways sometimes without deceiving.
Yeah.
And I think there's ways to hold out the vision to, I've talked about this before, about saying, well, let me give you a vision of what it will look like in the church and how good it will be. And it may just appear so good what this church is one day going to be that you won't even care about what music's being sung then. But the problem is that Machiavelli would say, if you're the prince, if you're the leader, and you know that this organization has to make changes or it's going to die, then he would say basically you're justified in perhaps not being completely forthcoming and upfront. But the problem is that if you take that leadership principle, who's to decide when it's worth being deceptive? I mean, for instance, I'll give you another example that's very contemporary to today in the church life, and that is that I've known a number of times where churches were interviewing a pastoral candidate, and they asked, "Well, are you aggressively promoting Calvinism? Because this might be a church that's doesn't have a Reformed tradition. It isn't Calvinistic and doesn't want that being preached from the pulpit all the time." Well, I've known some pastoral candidates who said, "No, that's not going to be an issue. That's not a front and center for me," when really it was. And so they were hired, and once they were in the pulpit, they began to preach every week on that and to push it and and until the point where they lost a lot of church members. And I've known churches that were running 800 people in attendance when they called someone, and after a couple of years of preaching the same doctrine week after week, they alienated and offended so many people that they're down to 150 people. And in that case, now that, what I would say is certainly nothing wrong with Calvinistic doctrines, but that's something that you just need to be upfront with and say, yes, this is important to me, and I'll be preaching it regularly. Well, because you may think it's a wartime situation, where even though they're running 800 people on a Sunday, that the church is in dire danger if it doesn't get preached to the way you think it should every week. But there are lots of churches that would happily receive your preaching and your doctrinal emphasis. Go to one of those and be upfront and say, yes, this is really important to me, and that's what I'm going to preach, and let them hire you. But the problem is that there is a certain integrity issue to say, if this is important to me, and I'd say the same with some liberal doctrines. I've known some pastors that had some very liberal leanings. They weren't upfront about it when they were being interviewed, but then once they're in place, now it starts to all come out. So certainly in the church, that's important, but also in business. If you say one thing to your people, but really you intend to do something else, inevitably that's going to erode your credibility. And of course, with Machiavelli, that's what often happens. People start to think, we don't trust this guy. He'll play fast and loose with the truth. Just depending on what he wants to get, how he wants to leadership with Machiavelli basically just becomes a tool of manipulation. How do I get these people and manipulate them to do what I want them to do? And so you have to just be careful with that.
Well, I think it's good that we read some books that are a little out of left field and maybe push a little bit of what we think of as leadership and some of the principles that we may hold dear, or some of the idealism that we hang on to, and but I think it's important to read and to take the good things that you can from it, principles that we can apply that we've talked about, but also be aware of the overusage of other principles, or just the downright wrongness of the thinking. And so
and there's sometimes obviously you can learn from things that you don't want to embrace fully. Machiavelli says cowardice is the leader's greatest vice. And I've seen that at times. We may have to have just a whole podcast on that, but courage is so essential to good leadership. And oftentimes what we say, well, we just don't want to drag our organization through conflict. Sometimes it's just really a declaration of cowardice. We're just saying it's just going to get ugly, and I don't want to have to deal with that. So he would say you've got to have courage sometimes to wade into the dark, ugly places that leadership takes you sometimes, and have the courage to confront it and deal with it and go toe-to-toe with some pretty evil influences sometimes. But someone has to do that. You can't keep kicking the can down the road and say, well, I'll just go find some other place. At some point, some leaders got to have the courage to say, this is a messed up place. There's a lot of complicated power structures going on here, and I'm just going to dig in my heels and do what it takes to get this place cleaned up and healthy once again. Yeah,
well, that's great. And let us know your thoughts on the book. And if you have suggestions for future book reviews, please drop us a line. It's going to be podcast@blackaby.org. And what do we have a book for next time?
We do. Just looking for it here, but it's going to be overcoming the dark side of leadership.
Ooh, all this dark.
The dark. We're kind of on a dark theme right now by
the underbelly of leadership,
and by Rima and McIntosh. And
we'll have links to it in the show notes for sure.
Right. Overcoming the Dark Side of Leadership. It's a book actually that when I was in an accountability group with 3 other men, that we all read at one point. And I think certainly we need to look at this. It's very relevant to today. Yeah. How is it that some very intelligent, effective leaders still can have some real dark sides to them that can sometimes sink their whole ship, or at the very least disappoint followers, to say, how could a guy who's done so much good have these bad habits, this dark side to them. And unfortunately, it's more common than we'd like to think.
Yeah. Well, look forward to reading that next time, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.